Nightline will not be presented this evening so that we may bring you the following special program from ABC News.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. America! America! America!
From the moment the first frame of film was shot, the television series America was destined to become controversial.
They want a solution to the American problem resolved quickly. Otherwise, they might just selectively attack 4 or 5 American cities.
But no one could have anticipated the range of criticism it would provoke.
It's a free country. ABC has a right to put on its fantasy about an America occupied by the Soviet Union with UN peacekeeping forces shown as brutal Russian collaborators. And in a free country, I have a right to say that this portrayal of UN troops is an outrage.
It lies, it distorts, it upsets people.
Unfortunately, I found it quite dull. And after the first few, say 10 or 15 minutes, I really fell asleep.
Good evening. I'm Ted Kopell in Minneapolis, and this is Viewpoint.
1, 2, 3, 4. ABC is promoting war.
ABC, we know it's true. You're another Reagan student.
World War III.
What has infuriated so many Americans and others about America? Among our critics, Ted Turner of the Turner Broadcasting System. Former ambassador to the United Nations, Jeane Kirkpatrick. Representing the UN, which has had its own objections to America, attorney Ted Sorensen. Joining us from Moscow, the spokesman of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Gennadi Gerasimov. And with me here in Minneapolis, the president of the ABC Entertainment Division, Brandon Stoddard, and the writer, director, producer of America, Donald Rye.
From Minneapolis, this is ABC News Viewpoint. Reporting live from Northrop Memorial Auditorium at the University of Minnesota, Ted Kopell.
Someday, perhaps someday soon, someone will be writing sociology papers about the phenomenon of America with a K. It wasn't the program itself. Most people hadn't even seen it before deciding that they didn't like it. There was something visceral about the level of dislike generated by this miniseries, long before it ever got on the air. It was as though its critics wanted to damage it, to prevent some terrible consequence that would flow if America got on the air. Well, it did. It wasn't as big a hit as its supporters had hoped, but it wasn't a disaster either. Last night, after 14 and a half hours of airtime, America faded to black. And tonight, we're going to examine some of the fallout. What was it, ultimately, that bothered people so much? Let's take a look.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. America. America! 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 America!
I'd say America is the right wing's ultimate paranoid fantasy come to the tube. The Soviets are portrayed as dark and demonic individuals who we cannot negotiate with. Andre, the colonel, may smile a little bit as he's breaking up America into 5 different countries, sending people to mental hospitals for drug-induced behavior modification.
There have been so many bad things which created your antisocial behavior. We're going to help you forget those things.
That kind of thing is Soviet bashing.
So the aim of this film is self-evident. It's produced with the most malicious intentions. To spoil the atmosphere, to break the relations, to paint the Soviets as the worst enemy.
The problem for me about this program is that it adds to that anti-Soviet hysteria that is so much a feature of various bad points in our history. McCarthyism, the period after World War I, of the red baiting, and all the rest.
Let me tell you what the Soviets are saying about the United States in their propaganda is something unbelievable.
I just wished, I suppose this is Pollyannish of me, that the Soviet Union and the United States could someday reach a point where we didn't have to bash each other and make boogeymen out of each other. I thought it was very poor and very badly done.
It's a fantasy. It's not real. It is not directed, against the Soviets. It is directed in terms of our own perception of ourselves, our own character, and our own need to address the issues of what it takes to make a democracy function.
I think people have a knee-jerk response to it, which is, oh, this is really a pro-Reagan, anti-communist film, and it's not that way. It's not that way at all. It's really explores what freedom is about.
I wish that people would get as mobilized over real events in the world as they are over this piece of fiction.
It seems to me pretty unrealistic that such an event could take place easily. And I do think that people in this country would defend the country. I don't think we would just sit passively by and let another nation take us over.
I lost faith in everybody. Nobody wanted to risk anything for anybody else.
Everybody afraid they were going to lose what they had. They knew it was bad. They were just afraid it'd get worse.
I was upset when I saw Americans behave in a manner that I felt was cowardly. I wanted to get up and really react to that.
I also object to the general portrayal of people who are for peace as weakening the moral fiber of the country. I consider myself part of the moral fiber of the country.
The whole message of this thing is to strike out at liberals or anyone that questions the direction this country is heading in.
Was that the plan all along? You just neglected to tell me you and the Russians were starting another country.
Of course not. I never noticed you being particularly interested one way or another in being an American. And the whole time I've known you, you've never expressed much interest, much less took part. Now, all of a sudden, it's important for you to be an American. Damn, I am so tired of this I'm an American bull. Where was all that patriotism when it counted? Where was that willingness to sacrifice? Nobody wanted to join the damn army to defend the country unless they got paid well. Nobody wanted to give any time to public service unless they could make a career out of it. And I didn't notice a lot of us giving up our lives in the last 10 years.
It is clearly hostile towards the United Nations, and it is very unfair to this organization, which is a universal organization, which tries to crystallize the commitment of all member governments to peace and to cooperation.
A lot of people are going to zero in on the film being perhaps a little bit boring, slow-moving, the film being a little bit silly. They might zero in on technical questions, but...
For us, who've experienced Soviet atrocities and Soviet imprisonments and occupation and so on,
it is maybe a good way of showing the Americans how Eastern Europe looks like, what it looks like.
I'm puzzled by and I'm worried that an American audience without that experience won't understand those scenes and will maybe just laugh at them or see them as not very important.
Totalitarianism doesn't need armies. It only needs to control a couple of things: the media and the ability to dispense privilege to some and withhold it from others. But of course, a weak and divided people helps.
And so we begin. We are at the Northrop Auditorium at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and we are going to go right to one of our first critics, Ted Sorensen, whose law firm, I should say, has been retained by the United Nations to complain about what, Mr. Sorensen? I mean, it's rather unusual, is it not, for the United Nations to become concerned at all about what is, after all, a fictional representation?
It is unusual, although I'm sure that if you and I put together a fictional representation, Ted, about ABC executives who raped and murdered and stole and used the logo of ABC, we'd probably hear from ABC about it. The problem is that the UN peacekeeping force is one of the great success stories of the United Nations. Today there are over 10,000 of them serving on the Golan Heights and in the Kashmir and in the Sinai and in Lebanon. They're being shot at because they're serving to keep the peace, to observe the ceasefire, to monitor conditions to make sure there's no escalation of hostilities. Finally, they get on television, and how are they depicted? They're depicted as brutal, aggressor, occupying force. That's a shame, and I say shame on ABC.
Why, Mr. Sorensen, is it so difficult to accept the notion that we're talking here about a hypothetical story, a fictional story that takes place a number of years in the future, in which the Soviet Union has, in some fashion that is not entirely clear in the movie, conquered the United States? Given that kind of a political reality, wouldn't it make sense that the UN wouldn't bear any resemblance at all to the United Nations that we have today in a bipolar world?
It doesn't bear any resemblance to the United Nations of today, but if you had watched the show, Mr. Kopell, as unfortunately I had to do, you would know that when they talk about 10 years in the future, they say that this occupation of the United States took place 10 years ago. That means the United Nations of today and its peacekeeping forces are about to be used as a tool of the Soviet Union to suppress the United States.
But we're not quibbling about a couple of years. I mean, if they put the whole thing 15 years ahead and said this happened in 1991, you still would have objected, right?
I would have objected because to use the UN flag and the UN logo, which are internationally protected marks, in a manner that badly abuses and misrepresents the UN and its peacekeeping force is, I think, a grievous mistake on ABC's part. Mr. Rai was honest enough to acknowledge that it was an error to use the UN flag and emblem, but he never took any steps to correct the error.
Mr. Rai, do you still think it was an error? I mean, did you ever make that admission to begin with?
And what I actually that relates to we were going to alter the design a little bit in order to make sure that there wasn't any close connection. The fact is that what the purpose of the flag in question is not the UN flag. It's a combination symbol. It's a combination symbol which has and is designed to have benign qualities. It's designed to make to be ideal. I think the Soviet flag and the American flag surrounding the United Nations is a symbol which to me is an ideal and would be wonderful if we were able to have that.
But is it necessary, Donald, to use something that is, after all, an important reality in the world of 1987, just to make that kind of point? I mean, couldn't you have used a dove with an olive branch and the American flag and the Soviet flag and achieved exactly the same end without doing the kind of damage that Mr. Sorensen's talking about?
I think my intention was to take a look at symbols and at the possibility of the distortion of symbols. The picture does not contain any UN troops. I think it contains a group called the United Nations Special Service Unit that in no way is designed by me or intended by me to reflect the United Nations of today or the peacekeeping efforts of the United Nations, which I personally have high regard for. What it is about is the sense that if we do not maintain a very alert sense of these institutions which we respect, that we are likely to lose them. To call something the UN does not mean that it is the UN. The League of Nations was a good idea, but the League of Nations is not with us. The United Nations is an idea, not something that is forever permanent. Unless we work very hard at maintaining it, it may not be with us.
All right, let me just make a couple of quick observations. They're more in the nature of technical notes. First of all, we're having difficulties technically in getting both to Moscow and to Washington. There's a certain wonderful symmetry there in having both those capitals blacked out, but that unfortunately is where we are in the moment. As soon as we are able to, we will be joined from those two capitals by Jeane Kirkpatrick in Washington and by Gennadi Gerasimov, the spokesman of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, from Moscow. I would like to go now, however, to Atlanta, Georgia, where the president of the Turner Broadcasting Company, who has been Turner Broadcasting System, who has been a rather harsh critic of the whole series. Mr. Turner, what is it you object to? I mean, beyond the fact, did you think it was bad television, or are you objecting to it on political grounds?
Well, Mr. Kopell, I saw a 90-minute highlight film that was prepared by ABC. I didn't watch the entire program. But I just think it's irresponsible for a medium as strong as television to use its power to build up paranoia, hatred, suspicion, fear, and prejudice against the Soviet Union at a time when we're in such a very, very dangerous arms race with 60,000 nuclear weapons on hair triggers pointed at one another. And anything that builds up this mistrust is damaging and very dangerous to all of us, in my opinion.
Now, long before, long before the series ever got on the air, you had already decided and announced that you were going to do what in effect amounted to a week of counter-programming on your own network. Isn't that a curious thing to do on the basis of a 90-minute highlights film when, in fact, a 14-and-a-half-hour series is going on the air, presumably has something of substance to say, and you counter-program for a whole week?
Well, we ran, I think, 5.5 hours of programming, which we did not see the show, but we heard about it, and no one would make a tape available because you didn't have it done yourself.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, a point that needs to be made, Mr. Rye, I'm sure is a rather tired man this evening because he only got through quite literally at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon with the last episode. So you're quite right. He has been editing, and it's a point well taken. You couldn't have seen it, but then couldn't you have waited for another week and then vented your outrage after you'd seen it?
Well, I could have, I guess. But we wanted to counter it at the time. We wanted to offer people an alternative and show them some of the other side.
All right, Brandon Stoddard, the notion that, and let's face it, there can be no greater moral imperative in the world, I suppose, than maintaining a non-nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union, not going to war. If a series like this in any way brings us a little bit closer to war, shouldn't we keep it off the air?
Well, let me respond a little bit to the Russian side of it, because I think you got to start with this supposition. It really is what you think about the American audience. How intelligent are they? How smart are they? What kind of respect do you have for them and their capacities to perceive what is true or not true? And I have a great deal of respect for them. I think they're very smart. I think they're smart enough to know that this is a movie, that this is not an agenda for world peace or against world peace. It's not a white paper. It is not to be put on the air to change the balance of power between nations. It's a movie, and it's a movie with Russians that they understand and know are not real. America is not about Russians anywhere near as much as it is about Americans. It was intended to be about Americans. How do Americans behave under the circumstances? What do they feel? What do they do? What do they believe in? That was the intent of America, and I think that's the real strength of America.
All right, let me stop you for just a moment because we've got to take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll do two things. First of all, we will begin to involve this huge audience that we have with us here in Minneapolis. And secondly, I'm told that we do now have a signal to Moscow, and we will be hearing from the spokesman of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, Gennadi Gerasimov, who has some observations of his own to make. We'll be back from Minneapolis in a moment.
This is ABC News Viewpoint, brought to you by Lincoln Mercury.
We are back at Northrop Auditorium at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and the whole point of Viewpoint is to get the reaction of people and to get the criticism of our audiences. And so let's begin with the first of our guests here in the auditorium. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Carmen Landberg, and I'm a Cuban refugee. And my question is addressed to Ted Turner. How can he make the statement that this is a fiction movie when I myself lived through the same experience in Cuba before I came to this country? The takeover of the Russians, how they brainwashed people, how the lines were there because of people were hungry, how you have to wait for a month to get an appointment for the doctor, there is no medication, there is nothing there. How can anybody that haven't lived through it can say that it's a fiction movie?
Mr. Turner?
Well, this obviously was a fiction movie, and it was stated that it was as such. But whenever there's a revolution, as there was in Cuba, and there was 200 and some odd years ago in the United States, there are terrible dislocations and very upsetting things. And the same happened in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened at the French Revolution.
Mr. Turner, you're surely not comparing what has happened in Cuba over the last few years with what happened immediately subsequent to the American Revolution in this country, are you?
Well, it was a revolution. It was a revolution. And so was the French Revolution. Every revolution is a bloody overthrow, a forceful overthrow of a government. And whenever that happens, a lot of blood is shed.
No, you're absolutely correct that the movie was fictional. I think the point that the lady in the audience is making and that she's asking you is, and maybe I can be so bold as to rephrase it, what country that has been occupied by Soviet troops would you point to where that initial breaking the eggs to make an omelet phase is over with? What country would you point to where, in fact, things have now kind of leveled off?
Cuba was not invaded by the Soviets or taken over by the Soviets. There was a revolution of Cubans. Socialist Cubans overthrew, it wasn't a democratic regime either. It was a dictatorship of Batista.
All right.
But it was not Russians. It has no parallel at all that I can see with America.
Go ahead, man.
Mr. Turner,
I'll tell you what, hold it for just 1 second. Folks, if you'd be kind enough not to applaud, because every time you do, it just makes it more difficult to continue with the dialogue. Go ahead.
Okay, Cuba was not invaded by the Russians, that's true. Not to the eye of the public, of the exterior people, because there were Russians taking over there. Before even Castro said that he was communist, Raúl Castro, his brother, his wife was a Russian ballet dancer, famous Russian ballet dancer. And that's where everything began. And Cuba was taken over by the Russians before we knew it. Everything was controlled by them.
All right.
As I understand it, Cuba was taken over primarily by Cubans.
Yeah, all right, I'll tell you what, let's move on then. As a matter of fact, let's move on to the, I don't know if you can see me back here, but the person in the center aisle. Go ahead.
I don't have the person at the mic.
All right, in that case, let's go to the aisle over here.
29-2, we're getting C. His reason is...
Folks, I'll tell you what, if we don't have people standing at the microphones, it's going to make it very difficult to do the questions. Let's take a commercial break, and then when we come back, perhaps we'll have things a little better organized. We'll be back from the University of Minneapolis, University of Minnesota, rather, in just a moment.
Tonight's edition of Viewpoint comes to you from the University of Minnesota, home of the Silla Center for the Study of Media, Ethics, and Law. Founded in 1984, Silla Center houses the archives of the National News Council and sponsors student and faculty research into media criticism and accountability.
All right, let me just bring you up to speed. We're being bedeviled by technical problems tonight. We are now making some contact with both Moscow and Washington, but each of our guests there is receiving what we call feedback. That is, they're hearing their own voices back when they talk, which can be terribly disconcerting. We're going to try and go to Moscow in just a moment, but first, here at the Norton Center, let's go to another question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, my question is directed to Mr. Stoddard. You just said that these Russians were not real, and of course it's a fictitious movie. And if it's just about American values and patriotism, had you ever considered not naming the Russians specifically, more like The Day After, being very vague about it? And if you did consider that, why did you then go ahead and point to the Russians? And to follow up on that, do you think if you hadn't done that, that would have led to a little less controversy about this movie?
Well, let's see. Ted, you're going to have to help me and break it down a little bit for me.
Well, I guess the simplest way to break it down is, can you have a movie like this without some identifiable villains? In other words, you just have a bunch of an occupying force, and it's never said who the occupying force is.
I think it would have been difficult to do it. I think that there was. Let's start this way. It's an implausible concept. It's unlikely that this is going to happen. Very unlikely. But if anybody was going to do it, it would probably be the Russians in terms of their capability, not their interest or intent, but their capability. Bermuda probably is not a good choice to work on this. But I think that was the main reason for doing it. And I think there is a sense of at least making it work on a dramatic in a dramatic structure, and I think we did. Let me just add that quickly. One of the things that I think was successful about this show was the audience, for the most part, kind of believed that the Russians were there when the drama began. I don't think there were a lot of people saying, "I don't believe it. This doesn't make any sense." There were other reasons that they had problems with the show, but not that one.
All right, Brandon, let me stop you right on that point, and let's go to Moscow, because I think that's precisely one of the reasons why the Russians, in fact, are taking issue with the movie, because if for 14 and a half hours, 40, 50, 60 million Americans, however many were watching at any given time, are inclined to believe that this kind of an invasion and an occupation is possible, that's not exactly, making friends and influencing people around the world. Mr. Gerasimov, what was your biggest objection to the movie?
Well, if it's, I still get my feedback, I'll try. If it's a study of your national fiber under duress, why involve us? I suggest that you use not red flag, but Union Jack or some other flag, and why involve us in all this psychological study?
Well, I mean, I suppose we can play games a little bit too much. Let's face it, we are the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. I cannot envision Poland invading your country, and I can't envision, the United Kingdom or Canada invading our country.
I cannot envision Russians invading your country. It is not in the book.
Well,
and our main objection is that this kind of stuff reinforces all those stereotypes which are there about our country and about our intentions. There is a very big gap between American perceptions and Soviet realities, as it is in this book, for instance. And this gap is being reinforced by this kind of movies. So they say it's just a movie, but it moves your people into the wrong direction of anti-Sovietism.
I suppose one of the interesting things that we will have to do in the days and weeks ahead, and I suppose someone will do it, is to take a poll and find out if in fact people are more positively or negatively inclined toward the Soviet Union now as a consequence of this movie. But Donald Rye, it must have... I'm sorry, go ahead, Gennadi.
I talked to Kris Kristofferson, who visited Moscow recently, and he said this is a good movie in the sense that it provoked a wide discussion of the state of Soviet-American relations. So every cloud has a silver lining, but still we don't like the movie.
All right, I believe that one of our guests here has got a question for you. Go ahead, man.
Mr. Gerasimov, you pretend in your opposition to the series that you are interested in promoting peace between our nations, when in truth you do not want the whole world to know of your inhumanity to man? Wouldn't the world be mortified to see actual films of the gulags? You show on Soviet television scene after scene of America's slums, poor areas, bums and bag ladies, and no scenes of America's beauty, her people and places. You also show Elvis Presley singing God Bless America with 25-year-old footage of the civil rights movement. I ask you, sir, is this truth in promoting peace in the Soviet Union or lies in promoting distrust of America?
If the question is about the coverage of your country and the American way of life in the Soviet press, in the Soviet media, my answer is we try to be fair. So we do not report only on South Bronx, not at all. We do report all good things that are happening in your country. So we try to give an objective picture of life in your country.
But I mean, I think what the lady is saying, Gennadi, is that, for example, we did a program last Monday, I believe, on Soviet television, and can you hear me at all?
No sound, sorry.
No sound. All right. Well, we'll leave that. Now you can hear me?
Now yes.
Fine. Folks, I'll tell you what, it's tough enough even without the skeptical tittering here. I think Mr. Gerasimov is genuinely having a hard time hearing me. One of your most popular television series in your country is something called TASS Informs, in which the only American who is represented is kind of a bumbling CIA station chief. I mean, we all have movies like that about each other. What is it that so upsets you about America, if indeed it really upsets you?
We have only one movie which you can put in this category. You have a whole lot of them, a whole bunch of them.
No, I can name more. I mean, I can name more than just the one. Rich Poor, for example, is another one that you have on. Rich Poor, which really depicts the United States in a terribly unflattering manner.
Well, I don't know what kind of a movie you are talking about. I don't think the translation is right of the title of this movie. What I'm saying is that I am all for, and my government also, all for better understanding between our people. And we have shortcomings here in our mass media. We can sit together and talk about better coverage of both countries. And I'm sure that during this discussion, overall, we will have more complaints than you.
All right, let's go to another one. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. Finish your point, please.
Okay, go for it.
All right, let's go to another questioner here in the audience. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Mr. Wright, your film intimates that an American president lost the will to resist the Soviets. Are you suggesting that we have two choices in dealing with the Russians, to submit to Soviet domination or nuclear war? Which of these choices does your film suggest we take? And don't you think it's time we start talking about how we can all survive on this planet?
I certainly do, and I think part of the unfortunate and I think very disturbing misconception of the picture that you reflect is that it is narrowly speaking about the Soviet-American relations or about the Soviet occupation of America. That is simply a story device that has very little intent in realism. The answer to the question of why the Soviet Union as opposed to Bermuda is that there are, generally speaking, two systems in the world today. One system is a system which the people serve the government. The other is a system in which the government serves the people. We happen to enjoy the latter. And the sense of who we are as a people and what our experience in the world is, what our experience in the world is not, is part of what the film is trying to deal with, not Soviet-American relations.
Let me interject here for a moment, because I think one of the problems you've got to deal with is what was in your head is ultimately irrelevant. What is relevant is what the public inferred from what you put out there. And it certainly appears that what the public got was a malevolent Soviet Union, a kind of cringing, cowardly America. That's what you ended up with. I mean, whether you intended it or not, a great many people seem to have inferred that from the movie. Brandon, you want to jump in?
I have some problems with that, Ted. First of all, I don't think we know at this point. The movie ended last night. I don't think we know what America thinks about this movie yet. I don't. And I think we have a way to go. What happened here was, in the beginning of this movie, was an enormous preconception, instantly, as soon as we announced this movie, about what everybody thought it was going to be about. And that preconception stayed in existence for a long time. It was prejudged more than any film that I've ever worked on or any television show that I've known in my life. And I think we don't know how America relates to this movie because we haven't had the experience yet of hearing from them in terms of what they saw in the movie.
All right, well, that's one of the things I think we're going to try and do tonight, albeit with a very small sample. Let's start with a small but brilliant sample from Jeane Kirkpatrick. I hope you are not having as much trouble as Mr. Gerasimov with your earpiece. What was your objection to the movie, and did you object before you saw it? Did you object to the concept, or have you watched it all, and do you now, in retrospect, object?
I watched about 4 hours of it, the first 4 hours, and I don't have any particular objection to it. In fact, I don't. At a certain level, I would say it was dull and it was too long, and at another level, it was quite moving. I think that much more interesting, frankly, than the film itself has been the reaction to it. I think it's functioning as a Rorschach inkblot test, as it were, and people are projecting all kinds of not only concerns but intolerances, very interesting excitement and intolerance about this film. And I think that's the most fascinating thing. I think it's interesting how many people don't want American television to portray American vulnerability. But in fact, the United States is vulnerable today, and that fact is very agitating to a lot of people.
Let me ask you a question. Yes. Why did you stop watching? Did you stop watching because you were just busy those nights,
because I was busy those nights, actually.
But I mean,
that's exactly the reason. I had to be out on those nights.
But you would have gone on watching.
I would have gone on watching, and had I been exactly, precisely, I would have. And as a matter of fact, I expect to finish watching it with videotape.
Ted Turner, let me ask you. You said you watched 90 minutes of it. Did that convince you that you don't want to see the whole thing, or did you make any effort to, or you're going to make an effort to?
Ted, I don't watch much network television, I have to say, and I'm certainly not going to spend 14 hours watching that garbage. I watched enough of it, and I read about it, and I saw what you showed about it tonight, which was even worse and wasn't in the 90 minutes. I don't need to see the Nazi films that were done against the Jews in the 30s. You know, it's the same type of hate film. This thing was wrong, and Brandon Stoddard and Rye are mumbling around. Irresponsible is what it was. Irresponsible television, in my opinion.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to take a break and then we'll come back to you, because I'd like you to explain to me why it is you found it irresponsible and whether indeed you would like to be judged by the same standards without people watching what you have to put out, but just do it on the basis of what others say. We'll come back in just a moment.
Live from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Viewpoint continues with Ted Kopell.
And we're going to go immediately to another one of our guests here in the auditorium. Yes, go ahead, please. I can't see you, so yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Mr. Rye, you didn't tell us in the movie how the Soviet Union took over the United States. I could envision a scenario where the Soviet Union perfected their strategic defense initiative before the United States did, and was then able to blackmail the United States into a surrender. Did you consider anything like that?
No, I didn't, because that wasn't the point of the film. The point of the film has more to do with the sense of a country which is united and strong economically, educationally, and in terms of the cohesion of the goals of its people than a defense system. Defense systems, in terms of this film, what this film is saying, are external to the true defense of a country, which is the people themselves and their sense of what the country is about, what their purposes are, and what they perceive the goal of the country to be.
It's kind of a huge omission, though. I mean, why did you leave it out? Why not? Because I mean, there's a book version of this that you put out, and there you kind of give passing reference to what, the explosion of a few nuclear devices that knock out the communications system in the United States altogether. But why not begin with some kind of explanation as to how this came about? You sort of leave everyone with the impression that America just kind of collapsed.
Can I take a shot?
Sure.
Right. There are two movies, Ted. This is a movie, and without being redundant, it's a movie that deals with what happens after they're already here. That's what we were interested in. We were not particularly interested in how they got there. That is, in itself, a whole nother idea. What happens when you begin to question about how they got there is you open a scenario that is absolutely mammoth. I mean, Donald did do, I think, something like a 175-page outline about how they got there, because he had to know, and in a sense the characters did. But that was not the intent of this movie. The intent of this movie was to say, how do Americans behave? What do you do when they're here? What kind of person are you going to be? Are you going to be like Peter Bradford? Are you going to be like Herb Lester? Are you going to be like Kris Kristofferson? What kind of decisions are you and the audience going to make about yourselves in this kind of a situation?
All right, let me stop you right there, and let me go to Jeane Kirkpatrick. You spoke of this a moment ago as being kind of like a Rorschach test. Is it reasonable to, I mean, even just to raise the question as to how Americans would react? Is it reasonable to suggest that maybe we've gotten not only intellectually but morally soft so that we could be taken over without any resistance?
I think that it's reasonable to raise all of those and many, many other questions. You know, I think that it's reasonable to raise any questions about people that any writer thinks are interesting to explore and that provide insight into a people. And I think that conquest, the experience of being conquered, is one of the recurring human tragedies. And it arouses a wide range of reactions, which we have seen in our times in tragic situations like occupied France and occupied Netherlands and Belgium, and today we see in occupied Afghanistan, if I may say so.
Then how do you explain that there is this visceral kind of reaction, as I described it at the beginning of this program? People almost seem to resent the raising of this, even in a fictitious context like this. Why? Why do you think?
Because I think it's an intense commitment on the part of some people to the notion that it can't happen here. And it's a kind of rage, really, at the very suggestion that it could happen here. I suppose all the people who are absolutely furious at ABC about showing this movie are probably also feel very strongly that defense budgets are too high and that fears of the Soviets are entirely unreasonable and that we might as well be afraid of Bermuda or something. I think it's part of a syndrome.
Ted Sorensen, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I realize I focus on you primarily as someone who objects to the way that the United Nations was portrayed, but I mean, obviously you have a far broader view, I would think, of the movie in general. I'd like to hear it.
I think the basic theme, what does it mean to be an American, is worth exploring. I think the basic concept, what would America be like and how would it react under a totalitarian occupation, is a very interesting and provocative concept. But I must come back to the fact that that has nothing whatsoever to do with the United Nations. The UN peacekeeping forces don't take sides. They are there to keep the two sides apart.
So, I mean, as far as you're concerned, if the symbol had just been a different symbol, you'd have no objection to the movie at all.
Well, I think the movie as television was not altogether a credit to the intelligence of the American people. I thought that much of it was far-fetched in the extreme. But certainly it was a gratuitous insult to the United Nations, because the United Nations has never been used as an occupying force and never will be.
All right, let's go to another one of our questioners. Go ahead, sir.
I think obviously the issue here isn't whether or not show should have been broadcast. Of course it should have. We're in America. We can broadcast whatever we want to here. It's up to us, as you say, as individuals to judge it. And I think the opposite of what he said, saying that it's bad for our intelligence, will let us decide as intelligent. The question I have for you gentlemen, though, is what good has come out of it? Not all what bad. Everyone knows all the bad things that can come out of all of this. What good has come out of this, gentlemen?
Well, which gentleman would you like? You want Donald Rye? He's the one who wrote it?
Actually, I'd like to ask Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
All right, fine. Go ahead.
That gentleman is smart.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether any good has come out of it. I simply think, like the questioner, that this is a free country, and there's no reason this show shouldn't have been shown, and I think it's very unreasonable for people to object as strenuously as they have about the showing of this film.
Gennadi Gerasimov, maybe it seems strange to ask you this question, but can you see anything good coming out of a 14-and-a-half-hour presentation? I mean, after all, one might argue that this would make America very conducive to peace talks.
Well, I have already mentioned that it is good in the sense that it's provoked the discussion of Soviet-American relations. But of course, it's a very bad movie, very pedestrian. I've seen the first 4 hours of it. It's very dull, begins like a 19th century Russian novel, very slowly. Very many banal situations, very bad movie. And people talk about freedom, but I think that freedom, if you talk seriously about this, freedom must go with responsibility. And in my view, this film is irresponsible because it reinforces all those misconceptions which you have about Russians and about our intentions.
Cliches.
So it's a really bad movie. It is so bad that we want to buy it to show it on Soviet TV for the Soviets to see what freedom can do in your country.
Well, let me ask you, because I'd be fascinated to know, if you buy it, are you going to put on all 14-and-a-half hours, or are you going to edit?
Well, our TV, state TV, asked ABC Entertainment to buy it, and as I understand, the negotiations are going on. If and when we buy it, I don't know what they're going to decide, but really it's rather dull in certain places, at least in the beginning, which I saw. So I'm not sure if they're going to show all 14-and-a-half.
Brandon, would that be one of the conditions? I mean, if you sell it to the Soviet, it's kind of fascinating to think of this movie being shown in the Soviet Union, but I'd be intrigued at the notion of it being cut down to a spicy 90 minutes or so.
Didn't bother Ted Turner. Well, under the circumstances, I'm not sure we want to sell it to him. You know, I mean, I don't know if he liked the movie. We have sold the day after to Russia, as you may or may not know, and that was under the circumstances of no editing and no changes, et cetera, et cetera.
What about this one? I mean, would you?
I don't know,
would you
Ted. I don't. I think certainly. I think it would have to be sold in exactly as we broadcast in Russia, exactly as it was here. I don't think anyone has the right to go in on this particular work and cut and edit for whatever fits their purposes. I just don't
under
believe
under those circumstances, Gennadi, you still
Can
want
we
it?
talk price?
I say
I'm not negotiating this purchase.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we can close a deal here tonight. It's 14-and-a-half hours or nothing, is what I understand.
A little bit too many.
All right, I'll tell you what. Let's take a break. We'll be back from Minneapolis in just a moment.
Live from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Viewpoint continues with Ted Kopell.
All right, let's hear a few more of the criticisms of Amerika, the miniseries, and we'll start with the gentleman over there.
Yes, this is for Mr. Stoddard and Mr. Turner. I feel Amerika really has nothing to fear because our profit motive is alive and well, as ABC has demonstrated, by appealing to our sort of tasteless, what we like in television, by putting this on television. ABC could have put on a news documentary or news programs or even put Nightline, which is a good show, on a primetime spot. But instead, they chose to sort of do what the profit motive demands and put on a drama series which was sort of vague and didn't really take a stand. And I think they're just responding to forces that allow one to stir up things and try to achieve the best viewing audience and the most profitable market.
Let me just jump in very quickly,
Okay.
and then I'll let Brandon Stoddard respond more directly. ABC didn't make any money on this. I think ABC actually ended up losing money on this deal.
But the motive.
Well, you know, the motive, I got to tell you, you can make a lot more money with a lot cheaper investment than you can with a huge miniseries like this that cost an extraordinary amount of money. And they knew it was going to cost an extraordinary amount of money when they did it. So, I mean, you can beat them about the head and shoulders, and I'm here to help you, but I don't think that the profit motive in this case is a particularly valid charge. But Brandon, go ahead.
He said it better than I did.
All right, in that case, let's move on to aisle C.
Yes, Ted, this is Reed Irvine from Accuracy.
Reed, you're never going to believe this one, but your mic just went out. I'll tell you what, Reed, hold out just a minute.
Mr. Kopell, if I may,
just one second.
Screening of questions.
You may. I'm going to let you in just one second, but just let me get through saying what I'm going to say.
Thank you.
Reed, if you would be good enough to move over to another aisle, because apparently we're having trouble with that particular microphone. And now you, sir, if you want to come up with whatever objection you have, go ahead and do it.
Thank you, Mr. Kopell. Let me just point out these factors. I mean, God in granting us, all of humanity, the gift of life, the miracle of life, obviously does not want us to hate and kill one another. Let me just point out that the end of the first chapter of the sacred book of Genesis ends, and I paraphrase, that God looked down on the surface of the earth and saw how much violence there was, and God decided to end all life with the sole exception of Noah and his ark. Today in America, Mr. Kopell, there is a despicable acceptance, even affection for violence, and life is being threatened in three ways.
Sir, I don't want to cut you short, but I mean the objective here, and certainly we can all benefit from a reading of the Bible, but that is not the purpose. That is not the purpose of this particular broadcast tonight. If you have a specific question about about the program Amerika, then please ask it.
Yes, I have
Otherwise,
a
we're going
charge
to
and a
cut that
question.
mic off. Go ahead.
I charge that the program Amerika was hateful propaganda. Your program, ABC News Nightline, for instance, never asked, should we or should we not build SDI? It always asks, can we or can't we? I see in your program always a dissemination of what our administration is trying to get us to buy. And for instance, in the middle of ABC News programs, there is a commercial campaign by the General Electric Company that always sings, GE, we bring good things to life. Even if in one format of the commercial, you see a worker whistling as he's walking by a missile over his left shoulder. And in any analysis of it, death is not a good thing to bring to life.
All right.
I submit to you, Mr. Kopell.
I submit to you, sir, that we've had enough of the speech now, and we've just cut your mic off. I did give you an opportunity to ask a question. You haven't done it. Reed Irvine, please go to yours.
Thank you. Ted, I first of all want to congratulate Brandon Stoddard for picking up an excellent idea by Ben Stein and doing this series. However, I regret, Mr. Stoddard, that you turned it over to a man who said that he thought the whole idea was absurd and repugnant, and who succeeded in sabotaging it beyond all belief, both artistically and in terms of content. But having said that, I would like to suggest another idea for you.
Let me suggest, Reed, that the appropriate format here is that you ask a question now, and if you want to make it a critical question, by all means go ahead, but forgive me, I'm not going to sit here tonight and let you give another speech, so please ask your question.
I'm going to suggest an idea to Mr. Stoddard, and perhaps to Mr. Turner. I'd like Ambassador Kirkpatrick to comment on it. And that is, since this film has been so severely criticized as insulting the Soviet Union by suggesting that they might occupy us, I'd like to propose that ABC recoup by doing a sequel showing what it would be like if the United States occupied the Soviet Union. Now let's take this 10 years after, just as you've done here, based on our actual performance in Germany and Japan after World War II. where we imposed upon those countries
Reed, I think
freedom of speech,
I think we've got
freedom of press,
I think we've got the thrust
freedom of enterprise,
I think we've got the
freedom of
thrust.
integration.
I think we have the thrust of the idea.
All of these things.
The idea is freedom.
We
have that, and Reed, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told the gentleman over here.
No, I want to know, would they be willing to do this, and would would be very
That's fine.
educational
In that
for Ted
case,
Turner.
let me ask you just to be quiet long enough so that we can give each of them an opportunity to
Ted.
respond to your proposal. That's it, Reed. Now, Ms. Kirkpatrick, do you want to respond?
I don't think so. I'm
fine.
not in
In
the
that,
business of running television shows.
Okay, let me, Mr. Turner, then, the suggestion is that we create yet another broadcast, that this one somehow show what the Soviet Union would be like under an American occupation. You want to see this go on?
I'd like to see us do a broadcast of how we cooperate in space and how we could end the arms race and live in peace and harmony in this world. And that's the kind of program I'd like to do, not more about invading each other. I think we've had enough invasions. That's time to be friends, not to be invading each other.
All right, Brandon Stoddard, what Reed Irvine had to say about the initial proposal for the program, it was kind of a reaction to the day after. And indeed, Ben Stein did suggest, how about doing a program on what the United States would be like following a Soviet occupation? Now, you have the stomach for another one of these? We could make a whole series out of them.
I don't know, Ted. I mean, I was a lot taller when these began, so I really don't know about that. First of all, let's talk about, because I'd like to clarify something which has been in American television mythology now, I think, for several years, which is that America is the answer to the day after. Let's start with that. There is only one person who really knows the answer to that question, and that is me. The reason I say that is because I was the one who put the day after into development at ABC. It was my idea. I thought it was an interesting idea to see what happens to a bunch of Americans in the Midwest in the nuclear holocaust. That was the extent of my interest with it. I never felt, ever, that the day after needed to be answered. I never felt that it was left or right or anything. The show never dealt with those positions one way or another in the show. It simply said nuclear holocaust is terrible. Very bad for you. The answer, when we did Amerika, it was the same thing. I was interested in one thing, whether it came from Ben Stein or it came from, I don't care where it came from. 6 words came from Ben Stein. The idea that made it work, actually, the 10 years after, came from my wife, who is never mentioned anywhere here. In no way was it an answer. What intrigued me about Amerika, and what I think we have, was a story about people under an occupation and how do they behave? What do they do? How do they think? What happens to their families? What happens to their communities? What happens to their relationship with the communities? And this is the story that I think Amerika is about, and this is the story that will eventually come out after this brouhaha dies, which will be very short.
All right.
Sorry, long speech.
And why, in the day after, did he turn it over to a writer and a director who were both believers in nuclear disarmament, people who thought that this was going to be something, a cause that they could contribute to importantly, and when it came to Amerika, you took this idea and turned it over to a man who didn't believe in the idea at all and had as his leading actor Kris Kristofferson, who said last week on Donahue that he believed Mikhail Gorbachev was the most progressive world leader since John Kennedy. Why?
What we did in both cases was to go to the people who we felt were the most effective in making the ideas work. Whatever their personal politics are is totally up to them. What counts is not their politics, but what counts is what goes on the air. That's the only thing that counts.
Well, I hope when you do the sequel I've suggested, you'll turn it over to someone who believes in the idea and believes in democracy.
All right, thank you. We're going to take another break, and we will be back with our final segment with the audience here in Minneapolis in just a moment. All right, we are back once again at Northrop Auditorium in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and let's go right to our next questioner. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Breslaw, and I'm the Associate Director of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. My question has to do with the panel before us tonight. It's comprised of corporate executives, representatives of the Soviet government, the creator of the miniseries, but glaringly absent from this gathering is the people who made this controversy real. And those are the numbers of Americans who reacted in an unprecedented fashion, reacting strongly against the premise and much of the content of this miniseries. I was wondering if the point of this viewpoint was to discuss the controversy, how we could convene this panel without having parties to that controversy, namely the over 200 citizen groups across the country who wanted to make this a discussion on the United States agenda in public.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me suggest to you that the whole purpose of having an audience of, what, some 1,000, 1,200 people here is precisely that. I mean, the views that are being expressed at these microphones through this auditorium are intended to represent precisely what you find lacking in the panel. Ironically, you are getting more time on the air than some of our panelists are getting. But go ahead and instead of just criticizing the makeup of the panel, use this opportunity then to make, because I must say what I find glaringly absent in this broadcast so far is any criticism that goes beyond the kind of criticism that we heard 6 weeks before the program ever went on the air. What is it you're objecting to?
I would offer this in that regard, Mr. Kopell. ABC News poll of last year showed that 33% of Americans did not know that the Soviet Union was allied with the United States in the war against fascism. 25% of the United States citizens thought that China was part of the Soviet Union. It's part of the Soviet Union. Why, when ABC has 14 and a half hours of prime-time programming to comment on U.S.-Soviet relations and $36 million of its resources, do we use that towards further mystifying what the Soviet Union is really about?
And who would you like to have answer that question?
Mr. Stoddard.
Well, I think we've answered it over and over and over again, but we will answer it again, which is that this story is not about Soviet-U.S. relationships. This is a story about Americans. This is a story about people who were living under this sort of rule, this sort of situation, and what they do about it, how they behave, what they do with their ideals, what they do about the American character, what they do about responsibility in their lives, and that's what the show deals with. I'd just like to mention one thing in terms of the response to this show, because I don't think many of you know. This show, over the past week, was seen by over 100 million people. We average 40 million people a night. These are a lot of people who really wanted to watch this show. It was a better rating for us for this past week than we have had in a long, long time on ABC.
Yeah, but that's not the issue, Brandon. I think the issue that the gentleman is making is, if you're going to get people and they watch, then rather than giving them something like this, and to say that this is not about U.S.-Soviet relations is like saying that Black Beauty is not about, the story between a girl and a horse. Clearly it has a lot to do about U.S.-Soviet relations, if only because every dramatic sequence in the movie has a Soviet on one side and an American on the other side. Now, there are some scenes where you've got conflict among Americans, but it is that. What it does not seem to do, this gentleman is saying, is do anything to improve the knowledge of the American people about the Soviet Union as it is.
I don't think that was the intent. I just go right back to it. That's not the intent. We were not doing a show about here's how the Soviets really are or aren't or whatever. That was not the intent of the show.
I guess the question, though, is why wasn't... Well, go ahead. You ask your own question. Why wasn't it the intent?
Because that's a different show. In my mind, that really was not our objective.
But I think what this nation is crying out for, and I think evidenced by the size of the debate which this show has stirred, is real information that demystifies East-West relations. I think, Mr. Kopell, your show on Monday night about Soviet TV did remarkably well. And I think that people need a realistic picture of North-South, East-West relations rather than this Red Dawn meets Dynasty.
All right. Let's move on to the next questioner. Go ahead, ma'am. Go ahead.
Is this for me?
Yes, it is.
For Mr. Stoddard, actually, I think you kind of touched on this already. But it only emphasizes because you just jumped me here. And do you mean to tell us, now remember that we're a very intelligent public, that you and the other network chiefs did not recognize the controversy and the publicity that this would create for your third-place network?
I certainly recognize that there was going to be controversy, nowhere near the extent that occurred. That surprised me a great deal. The question then becomes, is controversy, which was really not created by us, it was really created by the media. Once we announced the show, the ball started to roll. The question then becomes, was controversy good for America, or was it not? My own feeling is that it was probably not, because I think one of the prejudging that was done about the show, the writing that was done about the show, the negative aspects that were done about the show based on either an idea or a clip or etc., created expectations in the audience that simply were not going to happen when you turned on the set last Sunday night.
Perhaps not good for America, that form of controversy as it ended up to be, but certainly for ABC.
Well, right now, I think what ABC was concerned with last week was America. And whether that controversy was good or not for ABC, I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next question, please. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'd like to address this question to the man from Moscow and to Mr. Turner, and that is, if they believe that the Soviet Union, that there are misconceptions in this movie about the Soviet Union, what are the proper conceptions of this country we are supposed to have for events which have happened in Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia? I can go on forever. What are the proper conceptions we should have about those countries? Because I'm afraid that they're teaching us to ignore some of the most important lessons of history, and that is what has actually happened in those countries.
Mr. Gerasimov.
I think the whole story about this film is a very sad commentary on the state of our mutual understanding, or maybe it's better to say mutual misunderstanding, that when you need a villain, you find it here in Moscow. And it is just one example. And I think that we do not want to change the spelling of the name of your country. We do not have any aggressive intentions, and the film tries to prove that it's otherwise, tries to show that it is otherwise.
I think, Gennadi, the gentleman's question, though... Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? All right, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to move on then. I do apologize to everyone concerned, including Mr. Gerasimov, about the technical problems. Let's move to the person in the center aisle. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Jay Lackertz. I'm a student at the university here. My question is directed to Mr. Gerasimov. I hope he can hear it. How can you say that the movie does not accurately portray Soviet policies and attitudes when thousands of Soviet Jews and others are imprisoned solely for their beliefs and convictions?
Gennadi, could you hear that question at all?
At the very end.
All right, I'll tell you what, sir. Go ahead, ask your question again.
The question was, how can you say that the movie does not accurately portray Soviet policies and attitudes when thousands of Soviet Jews and others are imprisoned solely for their religious beliefs and convictions?
Well, this is simply not true, your question. It's not true. We now have people coming from prisons, not being in prison.
Yes,
we never put people in prison for their religious beliefs. We put them for action.
It is true that Mr. Gorbachev has proclaimed a policy of openness, glasnost, but it is fact that there are still thousands and thousands of Soviet Jews and others who are not allowed to leave the Soviet Union, who are discriminated against because of their religious beliefs.
We have a new law beginning from January 1st regulating these things, immigration.
I think the point, Gennadi, and it was really reflected in the previous questioner's question also, is as one looks back at the past 30 years, let's say, of Soviet behavior, first in East Germany, and then in Budapest, and then in Czechoslovakia, and then in Poland and Afghanistan, there does seem to be a pattern which reflects a propensity for armed intervention, occupation, and the question is here saying, why is what was presented in the television program America not simply an extension of what the Soviet Union has already been doing over the past 30 years?
It is an extrapolation or extension, and pretty often extensions and extrapolations are not true. And our leader said that we are so busy with restructuring of our society, this is the main task, which means that we must pay the main attention to things at home and not abroad.
All right. Let's move to our next question here, please. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, my question is directed to Mr. Stoddard and Mr. Rye. You have not been to the Soviet Union, neither have I, and a lot of this country, especially the youth, don't know about the Soviet Union. And your portrayal, just like in a lot of propagandist films, give youth and kids who don't know an impression. And I want to know whether you considered this and what kind of effect you think it'll have on the youth of this country.
Donald?
Again, I don't think I guess I can answer that question best by being continually confused and I must say disturbed about the insistence on focusing on an aspect of this film that is very, very minor to me. The fact that the film has as its fundamental dramatic premise a particular thing, the Soviet occupation of the United States, but does not deal with that is, to my mind, the same thing as a catastrophe movie in which the dam breaks and the town is flooded out, and everyone is concerned about the water. Everyone's concerned in that kind of film about people's reaction to the water. In that sense, the Soviet Union in this picture is designed to be very minimally present in the film, and they are indeed minimally present. The only Soviet characters in the film are actually quite sympathetic characters. They portray the Soviets as intelligent and very witty and indeed with very, very strong humanistic tendencies which are expressed in the film. The tendency not to be able to accept that the film is about something else is very disturbing to me, and I think the controversy of which was spoken earlier was very damaging to the ability of many people to see in a creative work what the intention of that creative work is. I'm not in politics. I'm in the business of creating dramatic entertainment. The primary issue with dramatic entertainment is an audience which is open and receptive, curious, and desirous of an experience which they may not have had before. I think the controversy damaged that.
I hate to interrupt, but you're dealing with a lot of brand new minds that really, I'm sorry, but it's true, and you're ignoring the fact that you did portray the Soviets as evil beings.
I don't think I did.
So what?
I mean, I think it's that simple. The Soviets, if you see the movie, you can make that determination quite simply.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to end it on this note, which I'm borrowing from Henry Kissinger, that sometimes perception of reality, in fact, frequently perception of reality is more important than objective reality itself. If that's the perception that your audience had, and we will find out what the broader perception was, then it's a reality you're going to have to live with. But I thank all of our panelists for being with us this evening. Ted Turner in Atlanta, Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick in Washington, Ted Sorensen in New York, Gennadi Gerasimov in Moscow, and of course Donald Rye and Brandon Stoddard here with me in Minneapolis. I'll be back with a final comment in a moment. There is one disturbing aspect to all the criticism of America. This, after all, was not Rambo or Red Dawn or Missing in Action, movies in which the plot never reaches the dizzying heights of a cliché. What seems to have genuinely troubled so many people about America was precisely the fact that it grappled with ideas Would Americans in large numbers become collaborators, as do many people, or as so many people have done in other countries under foreign occupation? Raising the question doesn't make it so. It's an idea, a provocative one to be sure, but still just an idea, the sort of stimulant we're supposed to cherish in an open society. After all, if we find nothing of ourselves in the collaborators, then where's the harm? And if a sensitive chord is struck, then shouldn't we be relieved that there's still something we can do about it? We are supposed to thrive on ideas, good ones, bad ones, brilliant ones, stupid ones. It is the venting of all ideas that pumps oxygen into the lifeblood of a democracy. And for a medium like television, which is not exactly saturated with thought-provoking material of any kind, stimulating a little controversy ought to generate applause. To their credit, hardly anyone among the critics called for censorship. What are perceived as bad ideas, after all, may be painful, but even they are preferable to a society in which we can't try good and bad ideas out on one another. Our thanks to the distinguished panel of guests and to our audience here in Minneapolis for their contributions to tonight's broadcast. Our special thanks to the administration and staff of the University of Minnesota for their assistance and for the use of Northrop Auditorium, and to the folks at our affiliate KSTP Minneapolis-St. Paul for their help as well. Tomorrow we'll all be back in Washington with another edition of Nightline. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Kopell in Minneapolis. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
For a transcript of tonight's broadcast, send $3 to Viewpoint Transcripts, 2 John Street, New York, New York, 10038. Viewpoint is a presentation of ABC News.